Our next speaker is Brian Springhall. He's a PhD student studying the communication behaviors of bats at North Dakota State University. Brian's primary research interest is the interplay between social organization, communication, and cognition. His research focuses on how bats encode and respond to socially relevant information in their communication signals. And previously, Brian did his master's at the University of Carolina. And for his thesis, he used passive acoustic monitoring to study the in-flight social calls of evening and brown bats. So I'm going to pass you on to Brian. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to be talking about the in-flight social calls of big brown and evening bats. Before we talk about bats specifically, I'll talk a little bit about animal communication more generally. One of the main selective pressures driving a species' communication system is going to be its social organization. An example of this can be seen in the closely related barn and cliff swallows. With barn swallows, breeding pairs roost solitarily, so there's very little risk of them mixing up their chicks for another breeding pair's chicks. As a result, their chicks produce relatively simple isolation calls that do not encode much individual information. On the other hand, cliff swallows nest in very large aggregates, so there are going to be the offspring of a lot of different breeding pairs around. There's a potential risk for confusion, so their chicks produce very complex isolation calls that contain a lot more individual specific information that allows the parents to locate their offspring. So bats exhibit a tremendous diversity of social organization. You have solitary living species like the eastern red, and then you have the Brazilian free-tailed bat, whose social groups can exceed 1 million individuals. And then within socially living bats, there are some species that have very simple social groups, like big brown bats. Their aggregations are mostly huddling together for warmth, jostling for space, but that's really about it. And then you've got vampire bats, who have very complex networks of reciprocal blood sharing. Most species of bats produce echolocation calls for navigation and foraging. And these echolocation calls do contain some socially relevant information. Species, for instance, and in some species, individual identity. And bats do pay attention to this information in echolocation calls. But bats also have dedicated social calls that solely function for communication between individuals. Some examples of big brown bat social calls are pictured in the second and third rows of this figure. And so you can see that there are a lot of different types that have very different spectral and temporal parameters, both from one another and from the echolocation calls shown in the first row. Most of what we know about bat social communication pertains to their communication behaviors in the roost. Now, the roost is going to be where most of their social interactions occur, but there are going to be behavioral contexts that occur mostly, if not entirely, in flight, such as foraging. And while the bat pictured here is foraging on its own, bats may also forage along with other group mates, so they may be cooperating to locate food, or once they have located it, to defend it from other bats. And so they may use social calls to maintain group cohesion. They may use social calls when competing with other bats. Additionally, bats in flight are going to be exposed to predation risks, such as the unfortunate individual shown in the top right image. And that one didn't make it very far out of the roost at all. And when attacked by predators, bats produce distress calls that can elicit mobbing of the predator, which can give the bat a chance to escape. It doesn't always work. And then bats are going to be trying to return to their roost at the end of the night, and they may be communicating with group mates to locate the roost, such as in the case of disc-wing bats, where the social group will change its roost pretty much every night. So if we want to have a full understanding of bat communication behaviors, we have to look not just at what they're communicating in the roost, but how they're communicating in flight. But studying bat communication in flight is more difficult because it's hard to track a small flying nocturnal mammal whose vocalizations are mostly inaudible to the human ear. In recent years, passive acoustic monitoring has become commonly used to study bat ecology and conservation because of the information you can gather about bats just by recording their echolocation calls. The recordings generated in these studies often also contain social calls. The bat pass pictured here contains 2 social calls. You can see that they are much longer in duration than the echolocation calls and a little bit lower in frequency. And using other information in these recordings, we can then try and understand the context in which these social calls were produced. So we've got the social calls themselves, and then we've got the surrounding echolocation calls. These are species specific, so we can tell which species of bat produced the call. We can see whether or not the social call was produced when the bats were foraging on the basis of whether or not the recording also contains foraging buzzes. And the recordings are going to have a timestamp, and you know where the detector was placed. And so you can see if there's any sort of temporal or spatial variation in call production. Perhaps some calls are seasonal, or perhaps they're only produced in a certain time of night. So I'm going to be talking to you about 2 studies that my colleagues and I conducted to test the hypothesis that bats use dedicated social calls to mediate different types of social interaction while flying. So in the first study, we used passive acoustic monitoring to describe the social calls produced by North Carolina bats. And then in the second study, which we're still working on getting published, we used playback of the social calls from the first study to try and understand the responses that these social calls elicit. Both of these studies took place in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a small park on the UNCG campus. This park has both wooded and grassy areas, and in each habitat type, there is a small constructed wetland. We had 4 detectors total, 2 per habitat type, and within each habitat type, 1 by the constructed wetland and 1 further away. 7 species of bats live in the North Carolina Piedmont region, 4 of which, the Mexican free-tailed, big brown, evening, and tricolored, are socially living species, while the other 3, the eastern red, hoary, and silver-haired, are solitary living species. We manually classified social calls to type on the basis of spectrogram shape. And we classified them to one of 7 types. There were downsweep social calls where frequency was decreasing throughout the duration of the call. These differed from echolocation calls, wherein frequency is also decreasing, in that downsweep calls were much longer, at least twice the average length of an echolocation call, often more than twice the length, and often they were lower frequency as well. Oscillating social calls contain multiple increases and decreases in frequency over a single pulse. Complex calls contain multiple distinct pulses separated by silence. Upsweep social calls, where frequency is solely increasing. U-shaped social calls, inverted U-shaped social calls, and quasi-constant frequency social calls. And we recorded social calls from 6 of the 7 species living in the area. So we didn't record any from silver-haired bats. They're not particularly common in Peabody Park anyway. You can also see that there were a lot of social calls from bat passes that contain multiple species. And in those instances, when there were 2 or more species in a single bat pass, we couldn't necessarily assign the social call to one of the species or the other. We just didn't have enough information from just the one recording. And so we just labeled them multi-species. Of the ones that we could assign to a species, most are either big brown bat social calls or evening bat social calls. So those are the 2 species that I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of my talk. You can see that the 2 species differ in how they use different types of social calls. So big brown bats mostly produce complex social calls, whereas evening bats mostly produce downsweep social calls. Big brown bats still sometimes produce downsweep calls, whereas evening bats very rarely produce complex calls. For both species, upsweeps were their second most commonly used call type. And while we recorded a similar raw number of social calls from each species, when we look at how often, or the number of social calls they produced versus the total number of times we saw them, we see that big brown bats produce social calls a lot less frequently than do evening bats. Though still for both species, most of the time when we saw them, they were not producing social calls. We had sufficient sample sizes for 3 call types to test for species-specific signatures: downsweeps, oscillating, and upsweep social calls. And we found that for all 3 call types, spectral and temporal characteristics differed significantly between species. Interestingly, it wasn't always the same differences. So for instance, big brown bats have their downsweeps have a fairly narrow bandwidth, whereas evening bat downsweeps have a fairly broad bandwidth. But then we see the reverse for upsweep calls. Big brown bats have a fairly high bandwidth upsweep calls, whereas evening bat upsweep calls have very narrow bandwidth. So these differences indicate there's the potential for a bat hearing one of these calls to be able to tell whether the caller was a big brown bat or an evening bat, and perhaps respond differently based on caller species identity. So next, we wanted to look at the context during which these calls were produced. As you saw in that bat pass that I showed you earlier, sometimes a bat pass that contains social calls contain more than one. So we needed to know which social calls were actually behaviorally or independent behavioral events from one another, and which social calls should be clustered together as part of a larger bat. So we measured the interval between one social call and the next social call, and then we used a 2-process maximum likelihood model to look at the distribution of different interval lengths. And we found that social calls that occurred within 4.4 seconds of one another should be clustered in the same bout, whereas social calls that were further apart in time should be considered as independent separate behaviors. So we then classified these clusters of social calls based on the different types that were found in them. And we found that big brown bats most commonly produced one of 2 types of social call bouts that consisted solely of complex calls, at least one, and then bats that consisted of 1 or more upsweep social calls and no other call types. And then for evening bats, they commonly produce 3 different bout types: bouts of 1 or more downsweeps, bouts of 1 or more upsweeps, and then bouts that contain at least 1 downsweep and at least 1 upsweep. Do note for this analysis of different bout types, we didn't look at the number of, if there were any effects of the number of calls per bout, nor did we look at the ordering of the different call types in the case of downsweep, upsweep bouts. So we use multinomial logistic regression to compare the context of social call bouts to bat passes from that species that did not contain any social calls. And so for this table for big brown bats and the following table for evening bats, a plus sign indicates that that variable was positively associated with the probability of seeing that bout type. A minus sign indicates a negative correlation, and then a blank indicates no significant correlation. So for big brown bats, both of their common social call bouts were associated with foraging. And then complex call bouts were negatively associated with high heterospecific activity. And then we also saw some variation by season and site. For evening bats, we did not observe any correlations between bat activity, either conspecific or heterospecific, whether they were foraging or the time of night. We only saw variation related to season and site. So far, I've talked about the bat social calls from the signaler's perspective. However, communication is a 2-way interaction between a signaler and 1 or more receivers. So in order to study bat social calls from the from the receiver perspective, we conducted playback experiments. So we used silence as a control, and then we used social and echolocation calls from big brown and evening bats. From big brown bats, we used echolocation, down sweeps, upsweeps in general, upsweeps that were specifically higher frequency, upsweeps that were specifically lower frequency, and then downsweep, upsweep bats. Since it turned out upsweeps had a bimodal distribution for frequency. And then for evening bats, we use echolocation calls, downsweep, and downsweep, upsweep bats. Trials began after the first bat sighting post-sunset, and trials would continue to be conducted until no bats were seen for 5 minutes. So before each trial, there was a minute of recording pre-trial to establish what baseline bat activity was at that time. Then there would be a minute of playback, then another minute after that of recording post-trial, and then 3 minutes of environmental recovery with no playback nor recording. We counted the number of echolocation calls pre-trial and post-trial to look at how they change after playback, and then compared that change for the different playback conditions to the change that occurred after the silent controls. When playing back big brown bat calls, we found a decrease in bat activity after echolocation playback and after upsweep playback. Interestingly, though, even though upsweep calls decreased overall bat activity, they did lead to an increase in social call production of the bats that were still there. However, social call production was still relatively rare. And then for evening bat playback, we saw that playback of downsweep calls led to a reduction in bat activity. There was no effect on social call production. So we found that bat social calls contain species-specific signatures, and our playback studies suggest that these species-specific signatures are perceived by bats that hear the call. For instance, with downsweep calls, we saw no effect for big brown bat calls, but we did see an effect for evening bat social call, downsweep calls, and then the reverse for upsweep calls. Big brown bat social calls were mostly associated with foraging interactions, and in the case of complex calls, with specifically foraging interactions with conspecifics. This is consistent with what's been seen in laboratory experiments where complex calls are used by big brown bats if 2 individuals are approaching the same insect. Evening bats produce social calls the most often, and they mostly produce downsweeps. In other species, downsweeps have been found to serve as contact calls to maintain group cohesion, and evening bats are known to sometimes cooperatively forage with roost mates. So perhaps they're using these downsweep calls to maintain group cohesion when they're looking for foraging patches. Bats avoided the playback of social and echolocation calls, possibly to avoid competition if they perceived the study area as already being high in bat activity. And so we noticed that these 2 species, they differ both in their production of social calls and in the responses their social calls elicit. While both species are socially living, they do exhibit differences in their in-roost social behavior, and their difference in in-flight social calls suggests perhaps they also differ in their in-flight social behavior. So some further directions that could be taken to follow up on this work. More species would always be good. We could do then a phylogenetic analysis and really test for the effects of social organization on communication behaviors. Could look into other levels of information encoded in the calls, such as perhaps individual identity or population. So we only had a single microphone at each site, but if a microphone array were set up, it would be possible to track the flight paths of the bats and then get a more detailed view of what they're doing when they produce these calls. And then could also look at the syntax of social call bats to see if perhaps downsweep then upsweep is different from upsweep then downsweep. And so I'd like to thank my co-authors. I'd like to thank my thesis committee, as well as Becky's thesis committee. I'd like to thank the other members of the UNCG Bat and Mouse Lab for their useful feedback, and all of the undergrads whose help with the lab and fieldwork made this all possible. The Wetlands Committee for letting us use this as a study site, and then all of the people and organizations whose hard work and financial contributions make the wetlands possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Another fantastic talk. Really, really appreciated. And you seem to have got a whole host of questions. So I hope you're good for answering them. I know we've got a few technical issues today, and Brian is kind of using a phone and his laptop and loads of other things as well. So he's multitasking whilst answering these questions. So, so without further ado, I'll go through some of these. The social calls that look elongated, screechy versions of echolocation calls, how sure are we that these indeed have a social purpose and are not merely a bat calling error, like a bat clearing its throat or having hiccups? I like that idea, that notion.
It's a good question. That's only one that we've had to grapple with quite a lot in researching this, because we, of course, wanted to make sure that they are indeed social calls, and some of the lines of evidence that make us think that they are legitimately social calls. They do seem to have specific contexts in which they're produced. They're not sort of just randomly distributed over time, which is more of what we might expect if they are just these sort of hiccups. They do, in some cases at least, seem to be elicit a response from other bats. We saw evening bat downsweep social calls produced a different response from their echolocation calls, whereas if they were just a hiccup, we wouldn't really expect other bats to respond differently than they would to echolocation calls. And also just see with what we see in the literature from other species. So it has been seen that in a lot of other bats and studies where, like, perhaps where they're looking at bats in a captive setting, or where they have video cameras and can see the response, that bats do often produce these elongated downsweep calls in social contexts. And mostly they seem to produce these sweep social calls for social cohesion.
Cool. Another question here.
Fishing bats.
Oh. Sorry, you keep breaking it. I'll keep going.
Okay. Well, that call type does sometimes have some other functions, like lesser bulldogs use an elongated downsweep call to avoid colliding one another. Oh yes, Falzerbush, great source, as well as Middleton et al. 14. I saw someone posted in the chat. Popped up.
Excellent. I got most. I don't know if it's a problem at my end or your end, but you broke up a little bit at the end. But hopefully it'll all sort itself out in the next few minutes. Thanks, Brian. Are silver-haired bats really considered a solitary species? In my experience, they form small maternity colonies. I'll leave that with you.
That is a good point. Yeah, they are sometimes solitary, but sometimes also do roost in small maternity colonies. So perhaps I should have been a bit more Dell when I introduced those species. So yes.
Okay. Kind of a bit of both, basically. For the Florida bonneted bat, I understand that social calls are typically lower in frequency than typical echolocations. Can this pattern of lower frequency social calls be generalized to all bat species? So I suppose this is a little bit like what Neil was saying earlier on. Are these lower frequency calls, can we put that across all species?
That does seem to be a general rule. I wouldn't say that all social calls are always lower frequency than that species' echolocation calls. Like the big brown bat upsweep generally in a fairly similar range frequency range to their echolocation calls. However, for both species, the downbeats, big brown complex call, they are generally an overall lower frequency range than their echolocation calls, though with a little bit of overlap. So for lower frequencies of the echolocation calls overlap with the higher frequencies of social calls.
When multiple individuals, oh, sorry, I thought you finished again. You keep freezing, so it keeps freezing at the end of a sentence.
That also might just be something I need to work on with how I speak. But so yes, it's thought that the lower frequencies in social calls are, as Neil mentioned, because lower frequencies travel further, and so a bat producing a social call wants other bats to hear it, so it's more useful for that call to have a longer range.
Yeah, no, sounds good. When multiple individuals of the same species are calling, is it typical for an individual to adjust their frequency higher or lower? Is this typical in most species? Thank you. I don't know if this is the social call or the echolocation call, but.
So I know that's done in big brown bats with their echolocation calls, and I believe in other species, though big brown is the only one I can name off the top of my head that's known for sure to do this. For social calls, I am not sure if anyone's looked into whether or not they do that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, there's a PhD in the making just answering that. This is a question that I'm moving up the list because I'm quite interested in it. Do solitary bats produce social calls even if rarely?
Yes. So we saw, for instance, a few social calls from red bats and hoary bats, and those are solitary species. And unlike the silver-haired, where they're sort of somewhat solitary, some social, reds and hoaries are definitively solitary bats. And we saw some social calls from them. People have all described some social calls from them.
Excellent. Some birds give a bug's call when they encounter patches of insects, thought to facilitate social feeding, so attracting other swallows. Do bats do this?
Just thinking. Sorry.
That's okay. That's like, well, so, I mean, no, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there are any where they do advertise food patches. I know some bats, like evening bats, are known to sometimes cooperatively forage. Greater spear-nosed bats, they'll use social calls to like maintain cohesion when they're cooperatively foraging. And they'll use these calls sort of both to maintain cohesion with their group mates and to exclude bats from other social groups from that foraging patch. They're herbivorous species, so it would likely be a tree or a few trees with some fruits on it. And bats definitely respond.
Oh, hopefully you've unfrozen again. Probably got one last question, and then we'll try and move on. But it's related to feeding. Does the production of social calls during a hunting sequence affect hunting success?
That's an interesting question that we weren't able to look in with the methods we've studied, although from some other studies, the big brown complex calls, when people have looked at them in the lab, two bats will produce, or one bat will produce this call if two are approaching the same individual. It'll be produced by the bat that's closer to that they're both going after, and the other bat, upon hearing that call, will sort of back off. So, and then the first bat is able to catch the insect without interference from the other bat. And then Mexican retail bats, which I didn't really talk about much today, though we did get some calls from them. They have a call that's in some ways the reverse. So when two bats are approaching the same insect, the bat that's further away will produce this oscillating social call, and that actually jams the foraging buzz of the closer bat. So the closer bat misses the insect, giving the second bat the opportunity to try and catch it.
Excellent.
So the first bat might turn back around and produce its own oscillating social call.
Excellent. I wonder if they trick each other into doing that. There hasn't been a request. There's not a question, but it's more a request. Could you please put your any papers or references to any papers? Could you put them in the chat? Lots of people want to find out more about your research. So please, any papers, if you could put something in the chat, you'd make a lot of people very happy. But thanks again, Brian.